In this section, we will be talking about part 2 of the introduction. But first, I'd like to make a methodological remark. In non-standard philosophy, which hasn't been translated yet, and I think that's a great shame, at the end of introduction number 1, you see afterwards there's introduction 2, so there are 2 introductions. At the end of introduction 1, Laruelle makes a point that goes well with the sort of point that I was making about the jump, the leap into the absolute. If we're talking about the content level, it's a leap into the absolute. Or I said it could also be called the leap into the new theoretical language. And that we would need a sort of trickle-down semantics to give meaning to all the lower level terms. And because we have this leap, here pragmatics, the actual practical use of these expressions, dominates over semantics, which is indeterminate at this moment, at this initial moment. And so it's the leaping into the unknown theoretical language and going with the use that will give it its sense and interpretation. So Laruelle says, and I think this applies to A Biography of Ordinary Man and basically all of his works, the axioms of this work, here he's got axioms and not theorems as in A Biography of Ordinary Man, the axioms of this work often surpass immediate understanding. They surpass the immediate understanding of its statements, and they force the reader and the author as well, who here has not many privileges. They force then the reader and the author to explain to himself or herself laboriously what he has read, or he or she has read, or what he, Laruelle, the author, has written, and which, no doubt, cannot always be deduced from it. So the which there is quite ambiguous. I don't think he's saying that the text can't be deduced from itself. He could say that, but I think the which refers back to explaining laboriously to oneself. So this explanation, also this meaning, cannot be deduced from the text. It's not analytic. That is to say, they must prolong or continue it in a new invention. So the way to understand is to invent. But you plunge yourself into the statements first, and then you invent with and by means of them. So that's his methodological principle for getting inside the new language. Now, this will become more apparent in the text that I'm going to read today, in section 2, where he will, because we can ask, why can't he explicate things analytically? So we've given a reason basically from the philosophy of science, which is to say that that's how new paradigms work. You can't deduce them from the old paradigm. You can't deduce them from the observations, the experience, and the experiments. You have to use a new formalism. It's true quite often in physics, for example. You use a new formalism that is not an empty formalism, but is, for the moment, not interpreted except in terms of a connotative and pragmatic network. And little by little, the denotative aspect will become, which is there, or the referential aspect, will become clarified. So, just to finish off with a sort of overview of what happened in part one. Part one was called From the Sciences of Man to the Science of People. And this from the sciences of man, the human sciences, to the science of people is not just a trajectory, it's also a combat between two paradigms, of which one has always been dominant, the sciences of man as inserted, as inheriting from and inserted in the meta research program, the Greco-unitary thought, with inscribed in its core the anthropological difference. So Laruelle goes through the consequences of seeing the illusory or hallucinatory nature of this anthropological difference. And so he adds a new layer after the death of God, the death of man, which took the place of God, was produced by the human sciences. And so in a certain sense, he's saying the human sciences have taken up that vacant place where God and man was before. And Laruelle is announcing the death of the human sciences, a transcendental death, because for him the human sciences are going to go on for a long time. So there is the death of the human sciences, and one could ask, what will take their place? Is his new paradigm destined to take its place? And his answer is no. On page 6, up in the first paragraph on page 6, there he enunciates 3 conditions for coming to a rigorous science of man, which excludes, the word is strong, excludes the Greco-unitary myth. So the conditions are that this exclusion of the Greco-unitary myth by the new rigorous science of man must be, the exclusion must be the effect. We went over this last time. The second condition I didn't fully comment. This new positive essence of man that is not reached by the play of negativity, but is posed from the beginning, this positive essence does not take, this is the condition, that this essence not take the vacant place of unitary anthropology. So he's saying that the place, at least from the transcendental point of view, must be left vacant. Sociologically, it will continue, but we must not try and find something capable of playing the same role and of occupying that place. So here the exclusion of the human sciences and of philosophy is radical, and at the end, in a tiny little paragraph at the end, he expresses it in the form of a wager. What's the term he uses in the forward? Are we still dealing with a final philosophical gesture, in which case it would be inside the place left vacant by the death of the human sciences, or do we have a radicality that is no longer in the order of philosophy? That's in fact Laruelle's wager, and he says it is necessary here to make a tabula rasa of the unitary prejudices of the sciences of man. So here he's appealing to a sort of more radical version of the Cartesian cogito and its skeptical methodological process. And he goes on to say we need this tabula rasa in order to be able to establish the rigorous science that philosophy will have failed to be. So philosophy has failed. When people say that Laruelle is not criticizing philosophy, he's just sort of producing something different that is maybe wider and so on. But he's saying no, philosophy as the enclosure of authoritarian predicates, philosophy has failed. Philosophy has a project of coming to account for everything and producing an explanation that is totally imminent. It has failed. He says quite clearly in other places, philosophy has failed imminence. But anyhow, in its definitional, constitutive project, philosophy has failed. So, what's next, you could say, although it's not a chronological next, what is the alternative, is perhaps a better way of framing it. What is, to use a word that he'll be deploying a little later on, what is the new paradigm that Laruelle is putting forward? And we get an indication in the title, Man as Finite or Ordinary Individual. Laruelle begins by reciting the lesson of or reviving maybe is a better word, the lesson of the first part. It is no more a question of reviving the interminable combat, what I call the agon, between philosophy and the sciences of man. So, in fact, there are these combats, these differences between the different sciences to see which science will be the ideologically primary state science. At a certain period, it was with the structuralists, it was being put forward that language was the royal science, linguistics. And no doubt today, many are in favour of informatics and computer science as being the sort of royal science. And so there's always combats for epistemological and political hegemony. But Laruelle is saying that all that is, despite what looks like incommensurabilities and incommensurable stakes and so on, all that is rendered commensurable by the overarching 2,500-year Greco-unitary research program, the meta-research program in which the anthropological difference is constitutive, and in which these other disciplines from philosophy to the human sciences have come forth and come to the fore. So, as we just said, we do have a combat, we do have an agon between that whole Greco-unitary mythical complex and something else that Laruelle is calling the rigorous science of man. One of the key affirmations that we've already seen is that we need to have a science of man as ordinary individual. So the ordinary there is not the everyday, the commonplace, or the statistical mean or whatever. The ordinary is what is outside the definition of the universal predicates that the anthropological difference throws up and experiments with. And Laruelle's affirmation is going to be that what is outside these universal authoritarian predicates, the real, man as real, is finite. So I think that's not obvious. And you get lots of commentators, they read, if they're in favour of Laruelle, man is finite, I'll just go along with it, yes, Laruelle says it, so I'm not going to think about anything, I'm just going to repeat it and not explain it. So I think this notion of finite, I don't think it's a mistake, but I think it's questionable in the light of the complexity that in particular Laruelle's 3 volumes of Being an Event have introduced, especially the 3rd volume. So I want to look at Laruelle's definition of the finite with the help of the conceptual tools, because I'm not a Badiousian, I'm not a Laruellian, I'm not anything, I'm just an ordinary man. But with the help of the conceptual tools that Badiou's latest philosophical contemplations have given us. Anyhow, Laruelle says, we're not going to revive the interminable combat between philosophy and the sciences of man. Okay, we're doing something else, otherwise we're never going to get anywhere. We're not going to make man exit from the enclosure that this big deal, but in fact little deal, combat between philosophy and the human sciences forms. In fact, and that's a crucial point, and that's tied to this leap. If you analyze man in those terms, any of the terms that even newfangled ones that come up from within the Greco-unitary meta research program, you're not going to go anywhere. You're just going to be running around in circles. You're just going to be subject to the same set of problems that he's analysed in the first part. That it's going to be incoherent. It's going to pretend to be rigorous, but it's not going to be rigorous. It's going to maybe use techniques for manipulating things and showing off its rigor like mathematics, but it's going to be cheap mathematization. It's going to use givens or data that are not experience in the radical sense, but are fabrications to keep the circle going. You're going to throw up figures of man that are puppets, theoretical puppets. Even dissolved man or dissolved the human is just one more variation in the same game for Laruelle. So you need an outside point if you're going to get anywhere else. So the outside point for Laruelle is man, and he says that man never entered this enclosure. And according to the translation, we need to posit or pose the man is determined and completed straight away. It's not indeterminate, waiting to be determined by scientific, in the sense of the human science, investigation of what predicates apply to him and how or why and in what combination. So I think maybe it's better there. This is line 5, to say qu'il est déterminé et achevé d'emblée. So probably it's better to say determinate. He's determinate enough. He's not indeterminate, he's determinate. Determined sort of implies some sort of passivity towards a causality or a theoretical genesis of determination. So he's determinate straight away. So he's saying basically that our ordinary man is inalienable and draws an inalienable essence from himself. So this is part of a long and complicated discussion within French critical theory to somehow remain in tune with Marxism while ridding itself of dogmatic overloads or residues. So you already got that in Althusser with his anti-humanism and which is the scientific Marx and which is the pre-scientific, so ideological Marx. And one of the things that was criticized and dissolved was this idea of alienation. So there are various ways of getting rid of the notion of alienation, but the way that Althusser took, and you can see that in Lyotard's discussion around the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, is that man does not have an essence. So man is directly multiplicities or assemblages, or in Althusser's case, a structural, a bearer of structures, and there's no unitary essence, so there's no possibility of alienation. What we think of as the negative aspect of alienation is to be rethought in terms of power and not in terms of humanist essence. So Laruelle is working within that tradition, and he's, as we saw in part 1, he's agreeing. He's saying, yes, I agree. There's no humanist anthropological essence. So that sense of alienation can't exist. And so he says outside that whole research, what I'm calling a research paragraph, a research program, but is inscribed in the basic structures and practices of society. Outside all that, there is what he's going to call a human essence, but it's multiplicitous, dispersive essence, and so it cannot be alienated. So it's not a unitary essence which could be alienated into something else. It's an inalienable because multiplicitous and dispersive essence. He goes on to say, and this is the whole question of visibility and observability. Man, through his real essence, is not visible within the horizon of the presuppositions of anthropological parallelism and difference. So this comes back to the observation language that I was talking about at the beginning. Whatever empirical visibility that is postulated by the philosophical and the human scientific arrays of theory and experience, they are incapable of even seeing man in the sense that Laruelle is putting forward. So they can't explain this real essence of man because they're incapable of even seeing man as Laruelle is propounding the essence of man. Anthropology simulates him, magically gives rise to him, and the essence of a man, or the essence of man or of humans, is for Laruelle not a difference. So once again, whether you have anthropological parallelism or difference, difference is implicit there from the beginning and becomes explicit in the decades preceding Laruelle's book. And this is what he's constructing his new paradigm against, or proposing his new paradigm against. So instead of difference, we need multiplicities, but we need absolute multiplicities. And all the rest is projections on the anthropological screen. So we're still in a cavern. We can think of Zoom here as well, but we're in a cavern. We're looking at projections and taking them for realities. And these projections, these avatars, these transcendent avatars, that occur within the human sciences and within the surrounding doxa, are inconsistent, unreal, and doomed to history. So, doomed to history, not that Laruelle is against history, but they're doomed to the sort of history that is constructed and analysed in terms of universal predicates perfused by the anthropological unitary myth. There seems to be potentially what we already saw before, a critique of Deleuze and Guattari here, when he says that all that philosophy can throw up is, and the human sciences, is homo ex machina, part of the philosophical machine, a part of being, of desire. So homo ex machina is that somehow philosophy and the human sciences is proposing what amount to machines, and from these machines man is emergent, but is emergent only as a hallucination, not really emergent, because man, from Laruelle's point of view, can't emerge. Man is there and must be there from the beginning. So man is the real object of a science as soon as we recognize him or her in his specificity, in their specificity, irreducible to the objects of other sciences, and in their reality, rather than in the mere possibility of the figures of the human. So the figures we've seen, there are these ghosts or man as a substitute, because we used to say Deus ex machina, and so homo ex machina is man occupying the vacant place of God. And for Laruelle, it's just not going to work. He says this double thing, that is to say, man is the real object of a science, a specific, irreducible object, and we must also recognize man's reality. So it's not a possibility, because a possibility is a construction out of universal predicates. So just as we can't deduce the existence of God from definitions and universal predicates, we can't deduce the existence of man or demonstrate the existence of man from the formal or abstract or universal predicates of our philosophical or scientific system. All we can get is possibility there. Man is the object of a specific science and of a specific experience. He says this is a single twofold requirement which can be nuanced later, though it does not suffer from this in its principles. It doesn't suffer from this. What does that mean? I don't think it means anything. So when you see something difficult, probably Laruelle is getting through. When you see something that doesn't seem to mean anything, you can say maybe there's a translation problem. So c'est une double et unique exigence qui peut recevoir plus tard des nuances, mais qui n'en souffre pas dans les principes. So, ça n'en souffre pas les nuances. It doesn't suffer, that is to say, it does not tolerate nuance in its principles. So it's not a question of suffering from its situation. It can be nuanced later, but in its principles, it does not suffer or tolerate nuance. The principles are homo ex machina, bad, incoherent, inconsistent, doomed to history, unreal, with all the faults that we saw in part 1, or man, real, specific, not just a possibility. Each science has its own way of sending the old unitary ideal of totality into retreat. So this echoes what we said in the first part, page 3. Every science that comes into being strains to capture all of reality. And so it identifies the whole with the real, the totality with the absolute. So that's when it comes into being. Yes, this dream of totality. But insofar as it's a real science, each science has its own way of sending the old unitary ideal of totality into retreat. It is born with this project of totality. That's what we can call the spontaneous ideology of the scientist. Some people, in fact, if you believe Laruelle's analysis, virtually everyone within the sciences, when they're not functioning as scientists, still believe in that sort of unitary totality. But insofar as the science gets going as a science, it forces the old unitary ideal of totality into retreat. Yes, faire reculer. So it forces it back. So the rigorous science of individuals has itself its own way of forcing the ideology or the unitary ideal of totality into retreat. It requires, in an ultimately radical way, that the whole and its modes, the universal or authoritarian predicates, not be all. And so we have a duality where the world, the whole, everything is not everything. Everything is just one side of this new duality. New in theoretical terms, new in the new paradigm, but for Laruelle it was always the case. So we have this new duality. We have the whole, we have the totality, we have everything, but it's not the absolute, because we have man, the real, the one, the absolute, outside all that. To see, once again we come back to visibility, to see the reality rather than the mere possibility of man. This is at the bottom of page 7. It is necessary to abandon the unitary or Greco-Occidental paradigm. So I've been calling it up to now a paradigm or a research program. So here he's going with the idea of a 2.5 century old paradigm that makes everything that has been thought within it, whatever the disagreements, the conflicts, and so on, that makes it all commensurable within the terms of that 2.5 thousand-year-old paradigm. Man is not and has never been an object visible in the Greco-unitary horizon. So, once again, man, the real man or individual as minorities, is invisible within the reigning paradigm. So what is necessary, he says, is to change the paradigm of thinking and to move from a philosophical paradigm to a paradigm we call minoritarian or individual. So he has a special meaning for individual, which is the individual as real. It's a word spelled like that. That spelled like that doesn't exist in French. Unfortunately, where the normal word in French is individuel, el, in English it's al already. And so for his new concept, Laruelle coins individual. And so we need some sort of translational prestidigitation to convey that nuance when we can't follow his orthography all the way through. So anyhow, he says we need a new paradigm, not the philosophical paradigm, but the minoritarian program. And I would say, that's great, Laruelle, that's great, stop. Why do you have to call it a science after? You've got a name for it. It's the minoritarian paradigm, which is based on a transcendental but finite experience of the one, as distinct from being the world and their attributes. So, once again, great, although I want to put into question the word finite in a minute or two. It's the nothing but individual who a priori precedes all forms of universality. Okay, but he's going to call that He calls it the thought of the one as opposed to the thought of being. That's fine. We understand what he's saying. All the Greco-unitary thought is expressed under the paradigm of being, of the thought of being. And they're unitary, incapable of doing man justice. We're on page 8, towards the end of the first paragraph. And instead of rendering him visible, so we've still got this aspect that the paradigm of being or of the anthropological difference is not able to see or make it possible to see man as a fundamental phenomenal content that Laruelle wants to pose and explicate. And instead of rendering him visible, they are satisfied with the substitute of an anthropology or a critique of anthropology. For Laruelle, they're two faces, two versions of the same thing. So we propose to break the alliance of man and the authoritarian predicates, to break the alliance of man and the philosopher, master of predicates. The hypothesis and even the paradigm must be changed. So we're talking about a new hypothesis and a new paradigm. So once again, the minoritarian paradigm or the minoritarian hypothesis, they're sufficient names for Laruelle's new image of thought. But he's going to go on and call that science. Transcendental science, although often he will leave out the transcendental, but he's explained it here. And then later on, he'll leave it out more often. So I think the choice of the word science is strategically infelicitous. That's unless you've got a whole set of reminders constantly at work, it's a noetic trap for me. At a certain moment, you're going to forget the qualifications and the attenuations and the displacements and the transvaluations, and you're going to lapse, even if only for a moment or a few paragraphs, you're going to lapse. I mean, if you're Laruelle, it's only for a moment, but maybe for his followers, this remains to be seen. Maybe the lapse from the transcendental into the empirical, so the abstracto-empirical conflation and assemblage of anthropological prejudices may totally contaminate and pervade the word science as used if we forget. So one of the whole projects of this book is don't forget man, don't forget the science, the transcendental science. Don't forget to transcendentalize everything. There's a whole anamnesis and a constant reminder not to forget. But there may be lapses, short or long or permanent. Who knows? So we need a new paradigm to break the mixtures and base philosophy on man rather than the inverse. Okay. There is a sort of new instance of his ritornello up to now. And then he goes further. He says, but this man, it will be objected, does he exist? Does he exist in any form that is not residual and epiphenomenal? Does he exist in a form because we're constantly saying that philosophy and the human sciences don't capture the meaning of man as real beyond mere possibility conjured up by the play of universal predicates. He says here, the human in man is not reducible to the sum of his predicates. The philosophizing of predicates and all the other predicates. However, these predicates are calculated. So it's not reducible to the human essence, to a calculation of predicates, whatever this form this calculation may take. Qualitative juxtaposition or qualitative assertion of a single essential predicate, qualitative and quantitative considerations, quantitative calculation especially. This is possible man, not real man. Real man is subject, nothing but subject. And we can think here of Zizek's transcendentalized, transvalued use of Hegel, where the absolute is not substance but subject. So at the end of page 8, we get into a phenomenon that I'm sorry, I must excuse Laruelle, I must apologize for Laruelle. We're getting, I think, the first case of one of his famous parentheses. So nobody I've seen explains these parentheses. The Laruellians that I've read just reproduce the parentheses, and it's meant to be obvious what they mean or why they're there. So maybe it is. Maybe you can find an explanation readily enough. I think some of the time the parentheses may be justified in French, but not in English, that has grammar that is slightly different. And in each case, we need to ask ourselves, what's the function? What's the sense of the parentheses there? So he says the essence of man remains in the one, that is, in the inherence that is non-positional of itself. And the of is in parentheses. So my hypothesis, especially with to, de, meaning of, may need another treatment, but in some cases. My hypothesis is that he puts the to, or the word in parentheses, in this case the to, in, because it's grammatically required by French, but it's conceptually not just not required, conceptually it shouldn't even be there. But he can't drop it out. Sometimes with de, of, you can drop it out in English or in French, both. But this is a case that is straight away inherent to itself. So I would say that the inherence of the inherent and the self are not different. So what he means is, by bracketing the two, is that it's straightway self-inherent. But self-inherent, we have the inherent part, is a predicate. And he's saying that man or the human and is a subject that has never been a predicate and no longer needs predicates. So it's probably best to understand this inherent to itself as self-inherence. The subject, man, the human, is self-inherence. It's not the subject and then it has a predicate of being inherent to itself. That's what it is. It's self-inherence. And this is the line that he takes up later. The essence of man remains in the one, that is, in the inherence, that is non-positional of itself. In the inherence, non-positional of itself. You can't really drop the of in French, so you have to put it, but he's signaling that's just linguistic grammar. In terms of transcendental grammar, it's not appropriate. So he's once again saying that the essence of man maintains itself. He says remains, but it maintains itself. The translation says remains, maintains itself in the one. That is to say, in the non-positional self-inherence. And they've translated in the inherence that is non-positional of, in brackets, itself. So with the first preposition in parentheses, to, we're saying at the transcendental grammatical level that the subject is straight away self-inherence. And with the second preposition in parentheses, in the last line of page 8, we're saying that the inherence is not just non-positional of itself. The of itself qualifies inherence and not non-positional. So the essence of man remains in the one, that is, in the non-positional self-inherence, or the absolute subject, to get back to the Zizekian parallel. That is a finitude. So here the question of what's going on with this word finitude comes up. He goes on, as a matter of principle, which will be explained later, we identify the absolute with finitude rather than with an infinite totality. So here's the first clue. Infinity here is being identified with totality. And because the absolute is not the totality, but something else forever outside of the totality, he's sort of making a forced choice. The totality is infinite, so what is outside the totality is finite. What he could have said, and what Badiou will say, is that it's infinite in another sense. And the infinite totality is finite in another sense. So what is this other sense? Badiou follows Cohen, and he says that there are two definitions of finite and infinite, well, of infinite. We'll concentrate on that. The infinite can be numerically infinite, in which case, for example, the set of natural numbers is infinite, or we can say that the infinite is whatever cannot be constructed, whatever of the infinities cannot be constructed by the use of universal predicates, of known predicates, universal predicates. So in that case, the set of natural numbers is not infinite. It's numerically infinite, but it's not infinite because it could be defined and constructed in terms of a universal predicate. So in that sense, for Badiou, there are infinities. They're still numerically infinite, but that are infinite also in this other sense, that they are outside any constructible universal predicate or assemblage of predicates, and so they're generic infinite sets. This is very close to what Laruelle has been talking about, and he goes on. Individuals are real prior to totality. They are not modes of a substance, and they are not even understandable starting from infinite and universal attributes. These attributes or predicates are universal and so infinite in their extension, including the demarcation that they operate between the elements falling under the predicate or the attribute or possessing the attribute in question and the rest. So here he adds what is a consideration concerning the analytic definability in terms of the analytic tradition that I was discussing at the beginning. It is useless to wonder if these predicates are included analytically or synthetically in the subject man, or if man is the difference of himself and language. So that's why Laruelle is proceeding in a way that's outside the analytic tradition, which tries to achieve deductive, at least compatibility between the various predicates that it's unpacking and the unpacking unpacked version itself. So he says, as I said, you need to leap into the new theoretical language. You can't analyze or synthesize your way to it. As we understand it, man is ordinary in a positive sense. So it's not deductive goal or point of convergence, or a convergence achieved by eliminating all the wrong predicates. It's a positive term. Man, or the human, is a positive term in itself. So man is ordinary in a positive sense, and is determined. I would say once again that we should call it determinate and not determined. Is determined before these and absolutely precedes the philosophical calculation of predicates, inasmuch as they are taken one by one. So you'd say there's a problem here. It precedes the philosophical calculation of predicates, inasmuch as they are taken one by one. Well, what if you take them all together or in groups? The inasmuch seems to say that that will be okay and it wouldn't precede them. Once again, I think here there's an infelicitous translation. In French, it says autant que ceci pris un à un. Autant que there means just as much as. So absolutely precedes the philosophical calculation of predicates just as much as they are taken one by one. So it exceeds the group of predicates calculated philosophically, and it precedes the group of predicates taken together in a philosophical calculation, and just as much when they're taken one by one.